Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Greetings of peace. May God's mercy and blessings be upon you. I want to thank you all on behalf of the Falah Center for joining us for this evening's program. This is part of our weekly Thursday lecture series, which is now moved to Thursday at 8 p.m. And alhamdulillah, we thank Allah for this opportunity to still gather virtually and remember Him and reflect on what it really means to live Islam. In the West, there's a lot of challenging questions that we face. And one of those is our topic for today, liberalism. And specifically, the topic for today is a middle path approach to liberalism. And we're very honored and blessed to have with us to speak on this topic, Dr. Zara Khan. And I'll briefly introduce her, but before I do, just want to let you know that if you have any questions, you can type it into the YouTube chat. Inshallah, we should have some time at the end of the program to answer any questions. So Dr. Zara Khan studied political science and social justice at the City University of New York, specializing in comparative political theory. Her main hope is to contribute to the Islamization of profane knowledge, particularly in education, politics, culture, and economics. Areas of interest include Islamic teaching philosophy, materialist epistemology, secularization, critical race, capitalism, neoliberalism, and neocolonialism. Human rights, ethical agriculture, cosmopolitan aesthetics, and the metaphysics of technology. She's an educator and a researcher. She currently leads the Yaqeen Institute's task force on liberalism and philosophy. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zara Khan.
Jazakallah khair, Sabrina. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Jazakallah khair to Falah Center for having me. Inshallah, today I hope to just share some reflections on this topic of liberalism, which seems to be an open question in the minds of many Muslims, and rightfully so. I'm not an expert in liberalism, just want to put that from the outset, but I have spent a few years in academia, both as a student and then also as an adjunct lecturer, thinking through some of these problems and these questions, as well as working in some Muslim spaces along the East Coast, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Maryland, and trying to understand and really ponder deeply on this question of liberalism and what can be a helpful relationship that Muslims can and should have with it as a system. So please accept this presentation from me, inshallah. It's just a series of reflections and questions that I'd like to pose to the community. Maybe in the Q&A session, some of the comments that you make can help us all understand this a little bit better, inshallah. So with that, I'll begin and get right into it. I will be sharing my slides. I do apologize for anyone who was not expecting that or is not too into slides, but you know, I can't really help it. I'm an academic and a teacher, and so this is really, the pastoral element is not my background, so this is, I think, for me, the best way that I can hope to explore this question with you all today. So, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulullah. Today's topic is a middle path approach to liberalism, and again, one of the things that I've noticed in the community of Muslims that I've worked with is that we seem to have two polar extremes of opinion. We have an extreme rejection of anything that is considered liberal or liberalism on the one hand, and on the other side, an extreme acceptance. And there are reasoned arguments on both sides, as well as uncritical acceptance of positions on both sides. And I'm hoping that today what we can do is take a look at what are some aspects of liberalism, you know, provide a basic definition, look at some aspects, and ask what are some ways that we can separate what is objectionable in liberalism from what is good in liberalism, and how can we as a community hope to begin to have a position that charts something of a middle course. And I will begin by just framing my talk with you by saying that every generation faces specific problems, and at the same time, every generation enjoys very specific opportunities. So in any age and under any historical conditions, the Muslim is able to fulfill the potential, based on Allah, of growing closer to Allah and doing acts that are pleasing to Allah. And the fact that we live in a liberal age and in a liberal space doesn't change that. So despite our liberal political order, we should still be able to utilize the best of what is before us and what has been given to us to achieve that potential, inshallah, as well as to offer some benefit to society. Now, this has 4 further premises, so I'll just go through them, and then throughout the presentation, I'll just explain them further, but here I'll just list them at the outset. The first one is that liberalism is a pervasive, all-encompassing, and ever-expanding social, political, and economic order. The second point is that liberalism is necessarily, not just accidentally, opposed to the traditional practice of religion in its fullest sense. The third is that despite these 2, liberal orders nonetheless present unique opportunities for us to do good. And the fourth one is something of asking the community to call ourselves to account and saying that liberalism is not to blame for our community's shortcomings, but rather we are the ones responsible for our shortcomings in our community. Now, if you'll notice, the first 2 points are what we can say is what's objectionable, things that ought to be rejected about liberalism, its pervasiveness, the fact that it doesn't leave space for alternative religious arguments or lifestyles or practices. And the second 2 are like positives, right? Things that we can and should work with, that, things that are acceptable to us as Muslims without violating our doctrinal beliefs, our religious beliefs. So those of you that may be familiar with the expression, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, one of the things that I hope to do is to say that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to this question of liberalism. We want to accept that there are harmful impurities in this system, and that we definitely should get rid of, like the bathwater after you bathe the baby. But we don't want to throw out the baby, right? We don't want to throw out what's valuable and beneficial in the whole ordeal just because we were so concerned to take out what was blameworthy or harmful in it. So that's something of the framing of this talk. And we can begin with a basic definition, just to sketch out some definitions. And I apologize for anyone who finds the theme a little bit not at their level of professionalism or maturity. I'm aiming this really at our young adults, at our youth, and inshallah, lastly to everybody else. So liberalism, we can think of it as a field of power that has institutional aspects and discursive aspects. I'm taking this definition from Talal Asad's work on the secular, but we can definitely use secularism, liberalism, and modernity interchangeably for the purpose of this presentation. Yes, these are 3 distinct phenomena, but there is so much overlap in the reasons for being and in the practices of these 3 that in my presentation, I'll use them interchangeably. So liberalism is a field of power, and it has aspects that have to do with the institutions in our society and what has become common practice. And it has aspects that are discursive or that have to do with discourse being the official opinion on a subject, what the experts have to say on any given subject, what is written about it, the scholarship, that is the discursive aspect. Now, what that means is that liberalism consists of concepts, practices, and sensibilities. Concepts being, of course, our theoretical constructions, how we understand things and define things. Practices meaning what it's good and normal to do in society and what is valued by others in the social space. And sensibilities is how we understand and approach new questions as they come up, right? Liberalism enables knowledge, action, norms, conditioned responses, and even desires. So there is this other level, other than our institutions and the official writing on a subject, which has to do more with the spiritual psychology of a person, or with sociology, with social relations, and really how we understand ourselves, even how we respond to things and what types of things we desire, what do we consider beautiful. The liberal social political order will have an effect and a tremendous influence. And of course, we all know this from certain questions that keep coming up in our community. Liberalism, here speaking specifically about modernity, and by modernity, we mean a very specific historical age. We don't mean modern as in contemporary, new as opposed to old. Modernity here is referring to a specific age that began with the Enlightenment in Europe in the 1750s. Materially, it began with the Industrial Revolution around the same time. And the author of modernity was the Western civilization, a post-Christian, post-Reformation, secularized Western civilization. So that's just to situate it, right? Because this is a story and the story has a history. So modernity as a historical age, which is really, for our purposes here, the same thing as saying liberalism as a system, is a project, or rather a series of interlinked projects that certain people in power seek to achieve. And this project aims at institutionalizing a set of sometimes conflicting and sometimes evolving principles. These include constitutionalism, moral autonomy, democracy, human rights, civil equality, industry, consumerism, freedom of the market, and secularism. And modernity employs technologies of production, warfare, travel, entertainment, medicine that generate new experiences of space and time, of cruelty and health, and of consumption and knowledge. That was kind of a lot, but I find that this is really one of the most succinct definitions for understanding secular liberal modernity that I've encountered over the last several years trying to think through these questions. We will come back to some of the components of this definition, and if anyone wants to go into it further, we can get into it in the Q&A. But for now, what I want to really point to is that when we think about American Muslims, about our situation today, and this question of liberalism, and we live in a liberal ecosystem, even if our mosques are insulated or our schools are somewhat insulated from specific problems, the whole ecosystem, the air that we breathe, to quote Morpheus from The Matrix, that is liberalism, right? And so where we find ourselves at this juncture is a unique intersection of several overlapping histories and forces. And that is kind of the way that I want to elaborate on this. The first, of course, is outside of history. It is before history. It is, eternally our condition as Muslims, which is the sacred covenant. And Allah took that trust from us, and we are bound by it. And it dictates a very specific theory of the human being. And when we say a theory of the human being, there are many competing theories out there in the world, not just written on paper, but in actual practice and as a set of social understandings of what the human being actually is. Now, our sacred covenant tells us that we are created by Allah, that what really defines us is our ubudiyah of Allah, our worship, our state of being in worship to Allah, that Allah has given us a fitra, a disposition, a natural disposition to know Him and to worship Him, which might be forgotten for a time, but it is innate and it is inside of us and will be shown to us again. That we are a natural disposition of dust mixed with water, and that Allah blew His ruh into us. And this is a form of dignity, which is of the, it is the most beautiful dignity that the human being possesses on account of this. That we are the children of Adam alayhi salam, and as such, we are God's representatives on earth and the caretakers of the earth and all of its creatures. Now, as far as the competing theories of the human being go, in society as well as in the books of philosophy, there are those who will say that the human being is only biology. There are those who will say that the human being is only consciousness in a very abstract sense. There are those who say, in New Age religion, for example, that we are energy in an abstract sense, put together by the universe in an even more abstract sense, in some kind of a happy accident, and that is what we are. And like I said, these theories are not only academic in nature, but they are pervasive. You will find them in popular culture. You will find these theories, reiterated in advertisements. You will find them in your children's cartoons. And one of the things that we can affirm is that when we look at ourselves, in this liberal ecosystem, beginning with the sacred covenant, we can affirm that we do not subscribe to those aspects, those liberal aspects of competing theories of the human being. We are not morally autonomous. By morally autonomous, I mean that every human being has the right to set the criteria of conceptions of good and evil. What is right for me may not be right for you. And what I consider to be, they don't use the word evil anymore, but what I consider to be unsustainable or harmful, you might have a different conception of that, and that's fine. Each one of us is morally autonomous. We don't believe that, right? There's not a moral relativism with regard to good and evil that we as Muslims can espouse. In this system where people are morally autonomous, it's really impossible to coerce another person to a specific understanding of what is good and what is right and what is wrong. That you can't really have people acknowledge the correctness of a moral value. Our liberal ecosystem also shows us that the human being is driven by the desire to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. That is the reason for nearly every decision that a person will take in their life. And, altruism notwithstanding, but even philanthropy and altruism and charity, even those somehow come back to this makes me feel good. Not every time, to be fair, but as a maxim in society, the human being is definitely understood to be pleasure driven. We're also understood to be self-inventing. You can invent any aspect of yourself. You can change, you can have surgeries done to change the way that you look to appear more like another species of an animal. You can, of course, now the big debates have to do with gender reassignment, elective gender reassignment, and self-invention of every type. You can leave your family if they're holding you back from your dream. You can, abandon your children or not. Really, like, nobody is supposed to hold you back from your fulfilling your self-invented potential. And that leads to the idea that human beings and civilizations are really just here to make history with a capital H. I won't continue to go too much into this, but as I mentioned, when we begin with our sacred trust, we know that our conception of the human being is very specific. So we are we have taken the loan of that trust. It is a heavy trust, as Allah tells us in Surah Al-Ahzab, that Allah offered the trust to the heavens and to the earth and the mountains, but they refused to bear it because they were afraid. But we human beings took it up because we have always been prone to be most wicked or most foolish. And so this trust, we Muslims understand, is too heavy for us to simply navigate in a completely self-reliant manner. Another overlapping circle is that we are part of the Ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, as such, given his resplendent example, we are able to have a roadmap in life, which provides us with values, with principles, as well as with very concrete practices through which Allah guides us to the straight path, to ultimate felicity within ourselves here in this earthly life as well, inshallah, after the grave. And the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, their examples also provide us with a roadmap for certain situations. We can find analogies in the lives of the companions. We can find our personalities reflected in the companions and really see ourselves in the Sirah to an extent, of course, by analogy is what I meant. And in addition to being part of the sacred tradition, being connected to the sacred covenant, being connected to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are also part of this trajectory and this great story of American history. And, why is history important? History is not irrelevant. It is from history that you learn mistakes that you should not repeat, right? Given similar historical conditions and material conditions. As the adage says, how can you know where you're going if you don't know where you came from? And so in a very historical sense, that is also true in terms of the American history. History is also of the signs that Allah points us to in the Quran. History is one of the three types of signs, right? Allah points us to signs in nature. Allah points us to signs within our own selves and the innermost workings of our own hearts. And Allah points us to signs in history. And there indeed are lessons for studying history. So if we take an extremely insufficiently short look at Muslim American history in 5 minutes, it's just to illustrate the point of why every sphere of the overlap, of those overlapping spheres in which we find ourselves is significant and is for us important to understand and engage with. We can begin with the first inhabitants of the Americas, the ones who call this Turtle Island, and those are the First Nations. And the Native American people, the Mesoamericans or the Amerindians, they are an extremely spiritual people. And there's a lot to learn with how they have engaged with the American story as a deeply spiritual people, as a people who believe in divine creation. I'm not saying they're monotheist, but they believe in the concept of a divine creation in a way that the liberal ecosystem does not really allow for in any relevant way. They also have a very spiritually infused view of life and the universe. And there have been several incidents in history that show us some of the battles that they've waged and some of the arguments that they've made. And there's a lot to learn from there. And we also, I think just to make a quick note before I continue, is that when I refer to different sources of knowledge, it is not putting those sources of knowledge on the same level as our sacred sources of knowledge, which are the criteria through which we can take what is good and leave what is harmful, what Dr. Sherman Jackson called scripture as a sieve. You put human institutions, and I would add human history through it, and whatever is good will come out and whatever is harmful can remain through the parameters that scripture and the Sira have set for us. So when I'm referring to looking at the First Nations or looking at other epics in American history, it is not to put it on a sacred level, but it's for the advantage of learning and finding value in other sources of knowledge within those limited spheres. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he took the advice of Salman radiallahu anhu to build the trench, and that was such an important piece of advice. And yet Salman was coming from a civilization that believed in two gods, the God of good and the God of evil. But that was not reason enough to not take a valuable piece of information. And so, if anything, that can be a guide for us in this regard as well. The first Muslims to reach the Americas, we know, came on Columbus's ships. They were his cartographers, but it's possible, some of the literature suggests, that Muslims came to the Americas even earlier than that, as early as the 12th century. And the picture here up on the blackboard is a map by Piri Reis from 1513. And he was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, and it shows the extent to which the travels, as well as him drawing on the knowledge of other cartographers from other civilizations that were not Muslim, how he was able to put those together. And there was a tremendous amount of knowledge. And the Muslims who reached the Americas at that time did possess quite an advanced amount of knowledge. We know that, in the Golden Age, the Muslims had already invented the astrolabe and the sundial and versions of the compass. And so when Columbus reaches the Americas with Muslims on his ships, the reason they're even leaving, what was going on in Andalusia at the time that they were leaving, it was the Inquisition. And so the Muslims and the Jews were being violently expelled or forcibly converted. And so that also adds context to us, because I know that growing intolerance towards Muslims is a concern for all of us. And so we have, this is kind of like one epic. In the following epic, we have the age of European colonization, and this is where we have the first mass migration of Muslims to the Americas. And that was, of course, in the transatlantic slave trade. Up to 50% of the 11 million enslaved Africans who were brought to the New World forcibly were Muslim. And we know that between 15 and 25% of that number died on the Middle Passage and sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. This is a really important part of our heritage. If we're going to have any conversation about liberalism today, I mean, chattel slavery was one of the most iconic liberal institutions that we've ever known. Even though liberalism professes, fraternity, equality, nonetheless, since the very beginning of the social contract, there were theories of personhood, and at the same time, there were theories of sub-personhood, right? Racialized sub-personhood, and this is, of course, well documented. And so, again, there's a lot to learn for us in this lesson. Muslims were no ordinary slaves. They were fearless, they were courageous, they were often more educated, they were often literate, they were pious, of course. And for this reason, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns had a fear of them. They were not afraid to organize. This is from an article submitted to Yaqin Institute for Islamic Research by a guest contributor, Margarita Rosa, and her research is about really the roots of Islam in in Brazil in this article, but also about a specific rebellion, the Bahia Rebellion, which even till this day in Brazilian history is the most significant rebellion that ever occurred. And what I found in this article, very interesting, is that this picture is of a man named Manuel do Nascimento Santos Silva, also known as Gibrilu, and he was the last surviving member of that rebellion, which in 1835, on a Sunday in Ramadan, while the people were fasting, you know, in this specific community outlined in this article, there were shuyukh, there were teachers among the enslaved Africans in Brazil, and the Muslims would go secretly and learn Quran from their teachers, and you know, they would have their prayer beads. They started to sew white garments to distinguish themselves, and they planned to organize a revolt. And when their revolt took off, it was not successful in a historical sense. It was actually squashed very quickly by the authorities. 4 of the people were put to death, 16 were put in prison, others were forced into forced labor, and many more were flogged. But even, you know, 50 years later, 75 years later, despite the fear of the Spanish and Portuguese crown of the Muslim slaves and them wanting to ban them, you know, there were as many as 100,000 Muslims in Brazil in 1910. And so again, these I'm presenting this kind of string of historical the string of historical incidents as a form of seeds for us. When we do our work, when we sow the seeds of our institutions and espouse our practices as Muslims and establish our communal practices, we may have success in the interim and we may not have success, but inshallah, we are sowing seeds for the long run. And all of this is to say that Muslims have been a part of the history of this land and have been engaged in very, very meaningful ways with society, politically and economically throughout that history. And so even now, amidst the liberal ecosystem, we can't afford to now suddenly disengage for some reason. There's an imperative to remain engaged. There's a heritage, there's legacy, there's precedent. And, you know, inshallah, there is benefit in it from a spiritual perspective if Allah accepts our efforts. So after the era of European colonization, we have the birth of this nation in 1776, and the architects, the engineers of that birth were the large landowners, the aristocrats, of course, the bankers. And we can't really have any discussion of our modern liberal situation without also mentioning the importance of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which led not only to one of the most iconic, if not most significant American Muslim leaders, which was Malcolm X, may Allah have mercy on him, but also as a result of the Civil Rights Act, you had the Immigration Reform Act, through which mass migrations from Arab and South Asian lands flowed into the United States. So we can move on. I will just add one last thing, is that if we look at the personage of Malcolm X, right, he exploited, and I'm also not an expert on Malcolm X, but he did exploit every instrument available to him in his liberal ecosystem to effect protections for his people, and he did it quite successfully. Now, his tactics may not work today for us, and as a matter of fact, a lot of that type of protest has been completely institutionalized, but I think the question for us is, well, then what will work today? In other words, there's no excuse on our part, following in his footsteps, following in this legacy, to be intellectually lazy to try to come up with that answer, or to be fearful or cowardly. But if we come back to our unique intersection of forces, we also find ourselves in the throes and in kind of the spheres of capitalism and secularism. And I'll go through each of those very quickly. Capitalism is an economic system in which fewer and fewer people can own the means of producing anything, and more numbers of people survive only by working and eventually by slaving for those few. So by slaving, I mean that the working conditions become more and more desperate and ineffective for sustaining their livelihoods and their families. Just a very quick note, to be a critic of capitalism does not automatically make a person a Marxist. And even if a person was a Marxist, that doesn't automatically make them an atheist, because I know that there's part of what's, the conversations that I've heard going around are trying to draw very hard lines in the sand, but I just wanted to clear that up. It's possible to appreciate Karl Marx's critique of capitalism and appreciate how intelligent and thorough and detailed and on the money it can be in many of its indicators, without necessarily espousing or promoting his atheism and his idea that religion is, an opiate for the masses. So when we think about capitalism as being one of our spheres that we're caught in, I'll just point your attention to the graphic on the right-hand side, this pyramid. Capitalism is a pyramid scheme. It looks a lot actually like, now that I'm looking at it, like the pharaoh's economic system, like in terms of who's at the top and how many are at the bottom and the proportions there. So I guess our prison industrial complex is a lot like his pyramid industrial complex. Of course, there's very real historical differences, but if we look at this pyramid diagram, at the very bottom, we have the working class that doesn't own anything and can't sustain itself outside of working for those who do own. So people don't own their own homes, they don't own their own businesses, and increasingly they are just working for wage salaries, which become more and more desperate for their sustenance. Those are the people that say, we work for all, we feed all. The next tier above that says, we eat for you, and that's the middle class, right? And I'm describing American society. These are actual segments. I'm not taking a value judgment. This is kind of just factual at this point. We've got the middle class who also works, of course, but because they own their dwellings or they own some part of the production apparatus, they don't have the desperate conditions of the working class underneath them. And they are essential to the survival of a capitalist liberal society because they help to maintain a level of satisfaction with the status quo. And the way that they do that is by consuming consumer goods. We'll talk more about that later. Above that, you've got the military, and I would add also the police. And the purpose of the police and the military is to physically enforce the status quo, right? Legally, but actually it's through coercion, coercion being an arm of the law. They are the ones who are responsible for maintaining that the working class and the middle class don't change stations or upset whatever is above. Above that, we have we fool you. Now, originally, I borrowed this graphic from a different website. Originally, they had religious leaders there, which of course I don't agree with. I don't think religion is out to fool people. It's a source of guidance, if anything. But here I replaced it with the media, with personal technology, with the news cycle, what used to be the TV. And that is, of course, propaganda and all of the messaging that helps to maintain the economic system as it is and keep it functioning. Above that is political and economic elites. These are the people who own most of the wealth in the world, and that is why they're the fewest in number. And at the very top of this pyramid, we have profit, which is the highest ranking value in the global economy right now. The only thing that matters is wealth accumulation, also known as capital. And if we look to the left side of the pyramid scheme, we have just these two pieces of art I wanted to share to help to explain this. We see and these are both by the street artist from the UK named Banksy. The first one is a Neanderthal holding a tray of fast food. And I think this really describes one of the contradictions that capitalism produces for us in this society, because in a way we are becoming more and more brutish in our understanding, but at the same time we have more disposable consumer goods to allay our fears. The bottom one is the Mona Lisa holding, I don't know what kind of weapon that is. She's holding a very deadly weapon of war. And this is such an interesting picture for me because the Mona Lisa is iconic of Western beauty. She's, a symbol of the Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, simple, beautiful. She's the aesthetic ideal. And then we've got the actual violence that is needed in order to maintain all of the goods and services that keep that aesthetic ideal alive and well and help to actually spread it all over the world through war and occupation. And then we've got the skeleton hands letting you know that everything is all good because capitalism is actually not a sustainable system at all. It's actually on its deathbed, but it keeps telling you that everything is a-okay. When we look at our obligation as Muslims towards being stewards of the earth, and when we understand that all of the animals and even the trees and the plants will ask, will report to Allah about us on the Day of Judgment as to what we did or did not do, and any cruelty that we may have caused any of them. Capitalism has a very specific relationship with nature. This is a photograph from photojournalist and artist Chris Jordan's collection called Midway, which is named after an island in the Pacific. And this is a baby albatross bird, which has died like millions of others. It's a phenomenon at this point, because the parents fly away to get food for the babies, and they go to the ocean and they pick out what they think is plankton and other nutritious sources of sustenance for their babies. But what they pick up is lighters, bottle caps, pieces of toothbrush, all manner of plastic throwaway that has come hundreds of miles from the nearest continent and floated and formed as gyre in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is about the size of the continental United States. And they pick this plastic up and they feed it to their babies, and the babies die. And that is exactly what this carcass is showing. And this is not incidental to capitalism. And capitalism and liberalism are not really inseparable at this point. Liberalism is an economic justification and a political arrangement of forces which allows the work of capitalism, global capitalism, to continue. Wars are fought to protect markets. We all know this, right? So my discussion into capitalism is not off the subject. It's just looking at one of the spheres of how we should engage with liberalism. So I thank Sidi Ramis Kent for sharing this work with me by Richard Heinberg. And in it, the author really shows that the human activities in the last 100 years have had such a tremendous environmental impact. We have habitat destruction, species extinction. That rate has gone up by 1,000 times. The burning of fossil fuels leads to buildup of greenhouse gases, which warms the atmosphere, which melts the glaciers, which raises the sea levels, which is having detrimental effects for many nations across the globe. We have topsoil disappearing at over 25 billion tons per year. The fertilizer is running off, which is creating dead zones in oceans and around river mouths. We've got discarded plastic itself created from burning fossil fuels, creating these huge ocean gyres, killing the sea life that I just showed. We have overpredation by humans, meaning humans as a predatory animal on the planet are being overly predatory. We are killing more animals than we need to. We really don't need to eat meat every day of the week. We don't need to have so much fish being served all of the time. You have many species on land and in the sea that are dying as a direct result of that. And basically half of all wildlife has disappeared in the last 40 years. This is of course heartbreaking. This is also very damning for us as a species, and I'm concerned for us as Muslims how we are going to answer for this on the Day of Judgment, especially if our own consumption patterns, and I'm speaking of myself and my family first and foremost, not of anybody else. How can we account for that? How will we answer for that when there's a direct relationship between how we participate in the global supply chain and in what that global supply chain is doing to all of the rivers, mountains, freshwater reserves, animals, plants on the earth? And I'll just continue. I think I made the point. Secularism, another sphere that we find ourselves in the midst in this unique intersection, is a very specific way of being in the world, and it's a way of thinking and acting that begins from a complete indifference towards God. So secularism is not anti-religious, as the saying says. It's just indifferent to religion versus non-religion. That in itself is taking a position against religion, because the truth of religion is not something that is supposed to be put in a bottle on a shelf with many other bottles, God and not God on the same shelf, because there are implications, as we just saw. If you believe in Allah and you believe in your stewardship and you believe you're accountable, then you will take care of the earth in a different way. You will take care of working class people in a certain way. You will take care of historical preservation, learning from history, engaging in your institutions in a certain way. And if you have an alternative theory of the human being, which is just self-inventing, pleasure-driven, history-making, then you may, not necessarily, but you may end in narcissistic, nihilistic visions of what life is and really end up wreaking havoc. This is not to say that all liberals are callous and don't care for others. That couldn't be further from the truth. But at this point, this was just attempting to do kind of a theoretical deconstruction, you know, to bring about some of the problems that are implied in this liberal ecosystem. If we, and I won't get into this. I've discussed this elsewhere, and I know that Falah Center scholars who have spoken on this channel, they have more than enough insight, mashallah, to deal with some of the confusions that are caused, the specific problems that arise in our liberal ecosystem. We've got the Christmas Mubarak, we've got the LGBTQ questions, we've got drugs and alcohol in our community, we've got racism in our community, and we have just a runaway greed, right? An obsession with money and how it determines our life decisions. But what about the unique opportunities to do good, right? I had said at the beginning, there's a baby and there's bathwater, and I've spent all of this time really trying to sift and classify the particles in the bathwater, but what about the baby, right? The Prophet ﷺ, he predicted that the Byzantine Christians, the At-Rum, would predominate at the end of times. And not only were they Christians and had their theological errors, but they were also formidable enemies of the Muslims at that time. And when the companion, Umar ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, heard this, I know this is very well known, and I'm sure you all have heard this. When he heard this, he said that, you know, if what you say is true, then know that Ar-Rum have 4 excellent qualities. They're the most forbearing of people in times of discord. They're the quickest of people to recover from calamity. They are the most likely of people to renew an attack after they retreat. And they are the best of people toward the poor, the orphan, and the weak. And as a matter of fact, and this is both beautiful and excellent, they're the best of people in checking the oppression of kings. And really, this is a luminous and a beautiful way of thinking that would be very useful to us, I think, if we want to chart a middle path approach to liberalism. And it really leads to the question, now that liberalism predominates in our own time, what excellent qualities do we find in it and in its people? So it's not enough to deconstruct and to fault find. As a matter of fact, to find good in something is much more beneficial than to find faults in it. But, you know, and you know, this exercise in deconstructing liberalism is not for the purpose of fault finding, of course. It's for the purpose of preserving our faith in times that have become increasingly ungodly and in which religious moral virtues are extremely unpopular, and who knows how long certain things will continue to be tolerated. So it's important for that reason, but it's also important to find what is good in liberalism, in liberal society, in our neighbors, in this system and in these norms, so that we can actually have a meaningful engagement, so that we can enact our good and seek our benefit for ourselves and for others in a way that is relevant and that speaks the language and that deals in the currency. And none of that means that we have to do it in a way that is going to compromise or violate our beliefs and our practices as Muslims. But it's very important, it's intelligent and it's compassionate to do so. If we think back to our pyramid of the capitalism, what can the middle class do to circulate wealth, right? How can we help those Muslims and non-Muslims in working class communities to own their homes, right? To own their dwellings, to own small businesses that can create means of sustenance and livelihood for entire families. If we think about the military on that same pyramid, we have this example coming from the liberation theology tradition in Latin America. And again, just keep in mind what I said about our sources of knowledge and to what extent we can draw on other traditions. That doesn't necessarily mean we're endorsing Christian liberation theology, I'm not. But we have this beautiful example in the person of Oscar Romero, and he was the Archbishop of El Salvador. And he, at the end of his life, right before he was assassinated actually, he sidestepped the apparatus of the state completely. At that time, the state was El Salvador was in a terrible civil war, which in the end claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It was a very tragic episode in recent history. But at that time, the state was extremely coercive and extremely oppressive. And the church was being asked to side on the side of the government for, threat of sanction, at the threat of sanction. And he was very fearless, and he sidestepped the apparatus of the national radio, and he sidestepped the nation state regime, the liberal state. And he spoke directly to the soldiers. And he asked them, he said, you are our brothers. He was speaking in a national sense, but he was also speaking in a Christian sense. And he said, you are our brothers, and I'm pleading you, don't kill these people. And of course, right after that, he was assassinated. But the point I'm trying to make is that what is the relationship that we can have with the various aspects and institutions in liberal society? How can we engage them in a meaningful way for enjoining good, for forbidding evil, for trying to sow the seeds of benefit in society, for trying to weed out harms in society? What about the media and the newspapers? And I personally, it's interesting because I'm a person who tries to avoid social media or outlets like that as much as possible. Although I do recognize and acknowledge that because there is psychological warfare in some of the open liberal media, that it's important for some people to show up to those spaces and fight that fight. Alhamdulillah, may Allah accept it. Newspapers and art and education, what kind of inroads can we make in educational systems? Not only Islamic schools and private institutions, but also publicly. What are some inroads that can be made? Policies that can be pushed to help preserve the fitrah of our little children for as long as possible before we kind of plug them into the STEM machine, right? Nothing against STEM, but just I'm speaking in general. What about environmental activism, right? What are some ways that we can spiritualize the practice of the protections of plants and animals in our shared common reservoirs of fresh water and fresh air? On a previous episode of the same series, I heard Dr. Shadley was mentioning that we have to be as social as possible, right? And if I understood that correctly, that means we have to build up our institutions. And I don't just mean institutions in the sense of let's register another organization. That is very valuable work, but it's one type of work. What I mean by build up institutions, as I think that Dr. Shadley was intending it, is to establish our practices, right? Individual as well as communal, and that those avenues, a lot of them being quite liberal in nature, the ability to gather and assemble, the ability to have groups of various kinds, what they call associational life, that is all part of liberalism. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we can exploit those to the best of our ability to make inroads for good. And when we even mention liberalism, when we go to look for our allies in these spaces in order to achieve these goals, which liberalism are we even talking about? And so we have this one professor, Anna Gagliardi, who mentions that there's two distinct approaches to liberalism. And in the American public sphere and in American policy, they are a tension, right? There are two sides of a tension that exists. The neutralist approach says that the liberal order is a hospitable and empty box, and that any culture, tradition, way of life, or worldview is welcome to pursue its dream in it. Pluralism is one of the highest ranking values, and it allows competing visions to coexist, and it suspends judgment on the rightness of any position. Now, from a Muslim perspective, we take that to be the exact same moral relativism that I was referring to earlier, but at the same time, for the purpose of practical work in society, it is beneficial that that hate crimes are illegal, right? It is beneficial that you can have masjids open as well as other houses of worship, because if it wasn't for that liberal freedom, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the practical work and establish the communal spiritual practices that we do. In that same neutralist approach, there's really no imperative to produce a better citizen, but pluralism is the highest value. By contrast, in a perfectionist approach, liberalism entails a distinct and concrete moral outlook. So this is, I think, some of the weight of what we feel. So if our schools or our masajid or our other spaces don't appear to be homophobic, this becomes a problem for for Muslims, right? The norms weigh heavy on us when that happens, because liberalism in this case is entailing a distinct and a concrete moral outlook. Those who are at odds with autonomy, secularism, self-development, and freedom can be tolerated or forced to comply, depending on what the political situation is at the time. In this approach, pluralism is not that valued, and producing a specific type of citizen, a better citizen, is really the direct interest. The reason that I'm mentioning this is because if we're going to build institutions within the community, and then porous institutions in which we necessarily draw on our non-Muslim neighbors and on sister institutions, of other faiths or of no faith to support us, to have some kind of mutual support, it would be useful to understand that there is not just one liberal approach, but as a matter of fact, there are other approaches. And even within these, and even outside of just this one specific schema and classification, there are many competing visions and competing outlooks for what would be the best way to have a liberal society. We also have to keep in mind that, like other traditions and like other ways of life, liberalism is an attempt to aim at a common good for society. And so at the very least, that should be forefront in our minds whenever we engage the question, but also engage actual human beings who are liberal and who value liberal values. And so just to conclude, I just want to reiterate that while we don't want to compromise our beliefs as Muslims by signing onto platforms that are clearly in violation of what Allah and His Messenger ﷺ have enjoined and commanded for us, we nonetheless have to acknowledge that we benefit, and that also is a blessing from Allah, that we benefit from specific liberal values or practices. For example, this sign in Alon, hate has no home here, and it's in many different languages. This, from, if a neighbor puts this up, this is a beautiful gesture. There is love in it, and there's beauty in it, and there's no way to, there shouldn't be a way that we criticize liberalism in one fell swoop. Everything liberal must be thrown away, and there's absolutely no good in it. And anyway, what is the alternative that is being worked on? I think that was my last point that I made in the 4 premises, is that it would be very beneficial, I'm proposing that we don't hold liberalism and the liberal ecosystem, liberal values, liberal norms, the liberal atmosphere, that we don't hold it responsible for what is wrong in our communities and in our homes, but actually it would be more beneficial if we take ourselves to account, because what have we done to engage in that system to improve it? What inroads are we making, personally, each of us, or in our institutions, to not only to combat it, right? Because it has to be both. You have to combat what is harmful, but you have to engage what is beneficial. So it would be much better, I think, to put some of the onus on our own selves and say, well, if there's something wrong with this ecosystem, what are we doing to cultivate alternative forms and structures? Jazakallah khair for your time. I apologize for being a bit scatterbrained towards the end. If there was anything good in it, may Allah accept it from me, and please forgive me for any mistakes that I made. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Zara, for that really comprehensive presentation and your insights on this. I really appreciate your balanced and nuanced approach to this topic. And definitely in this time, like with the elections coming up, this is, continues to come up, and it can be very confusing to navigate within the framework of our faith. I don't see any questions, but I'll give it another minute or two. In the meantime, I did have this question. So I think, like, when we're thinking about how we meaningfully engage with our institutions, sometimes it can be challenging to navigate that, when there's these pressures to be an ally. Like, what does that mean to be an ally? And so unless you sign on to all of that, then I think that there's like real fear of like even trying to get involved because of those pressures. But I think going back to an earlier point that you made about the fitra and preserving the fitra, I think do you have any advice on how people who want to engage meaningfully can ground themselves first in their faith, or maybe starting with the youth and the children, like how do we ensure that they have grounding in their faith, so that they're coming from a framework that's grounded, maybe before they're meaningfully engaging in society as activists and civically. I don't know if that made sense, but.
No, Jazakallah khair for that, for those two questions. I mean, I'll be completely honest, I need help answering that second question, right? Because faith is often a struggle in various forms, depending on the person. And anyone who really I know has very specific needs, questions that they need answered from teachers in order to fulfill that gap inside of them, and then carry on and continue and bear whichever banner that they are bearing in this work that we have to do. For me personally, as an educator and as a researcher, I'm attempting to do that work through engaging in the discourse. So in trying to understand concepts and theories and constructs, and really to look with a critical eye at popular culture and at media and at some of the assumptions of our age, and trying my best to push against them, both myself and in our family life. It's the example that I try to give my children, is to not be afraid to uphold ideas which may be unpopular. And I know that there are schools that are doing an amazing job enriching our youth in those areas and really trying to build for them an armor, so that when they do go out as adults into this ecosystem, that they inshallah will not be taken away and swept away by this growing tide of some very, very confusing ideas. But I think ultimately, a spiritual teacher is the best person that any of us can consult to help us to fill in those gaps, to help us deal with the deficiencies in our own relationship with Allah and our obedience to Allah. And that would give us a fortification. As a very general comment, because the first question I think you were asking was about allies, and how to be an ally without accepting an entire platform wholesale. But I think it's important, and it's not too difficult to be specific in what we accept and what we reject. So we can do that in a way which is polite and respectful, but also which is not afraid. And may Allah give us all the ability to strike that balance. It is a delicate balance, but nothing could be more important if we're going to enter those spaces and try to do that, so that we can be respected. We don't just want to be tolerated for our beliefs. We want others to find beauty, truth, and ultimate value in Islam, right? So if we're just always in a posture of placating, politeness to a fault, to the extent where you hide your beliefs, we're not doing a service to anybody. We're really maybe gaining a very, 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 very small and temporary benefit, but at the expense of making the whole scene more intolerant for the practice of basic tenets of our belief. I can give specific examples, I guess, but if you're going to be entering into that space of allies and supporting one another's platforms, I think it's perfectly possible to say, we are with you on number 1 and 2. We are not with you on number 3. We respect your right to do that because we live in a liberal social order, but you should know that Allah does not love that. So I think that it's perfectly possible to do that. And if we can all support one another to do that, if we see examples of other people doing that, maybe we'll be more confident to do it ourselves. But Allah is ever watchful, and He sees what we do in every space, public or private, and the conversations we have with any potential ally. Sorry, I don't know if I even addressed.
No, Jazakallah khair. That was a really beautiful answer, and I really appreciate once again the nuance in your answer. I don't see any other questions. I know we're kind of at the end of our program time, so I will just ask if you could just close us with a dua. That would be great.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. O Allah, please accept from us the best of our efforts and forgive us everything else. O Allah, please guide us onto the straight path. O Allah, please forgive our parents even as they reared us and cherished us when we were children. O Allah, please increase us in knowledge. O Allah, please increase us in patience. O Allah, please increase us in everything that you love and remove from us that which is displeasing to you. May Allah please have mercy on the forest fires going on in the Western United States right now. O Allah, please allow us to be beneficial to all creatures, big and small. O Allah, please give us the courage to speak the truth, even if it is against ourselves. Please accept from us the best of our efforts and forgive us the rest. Please bless our teachers without measure and increase them in this life and the next. Ameen. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير.
Jazakallah khair. Ameen, ameen, ameen. May Allah bless you, Dr. Zara, bless you and your family, and accept from you and put barakah in your work. We're so grateful to have you, and inshallah, when the masjid is built and inshallah, when things get better, we can host you in person. We'd love to have you again.
Ameen. Ameen. Jazakallah. May Allah bless you and your family and the entire Al-Falah family. May Allah protect and increase you all. Jazakallah khair.
Ameen. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Everyone.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.